Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for attending. So in this session, we're going to be reviewing paperless processing of AP payments, but also note that we can do AR receipts as well as employee direct deposit payroll payments. And what I'm showing you is the visual process flow within Sage 300 that highlights the process of taking your AP payment batch. And you notice that I have a little T in here. Nancy's just talked about how you can use the Tyrox SOX check approval. So once you've created the payment batch within Sage 300, you can incorporate the Tyrox SOX check approval to approve those payments, at which point you're then able to post those payments. And then once we've got a posted payment batch, we can then create the EFT file. And while we would say it's possible to print advices, we're going to suggest that you'll probably want to email those. And so we're going to show you that process and what that looks like as part of the presentation on EFT today. Now, because we start off with the payment process, what I'm going to do is just highlight for you that ultimately with EFT, we're not changing any of the processes. As Nancy referred to in her presentation, all we're doing is incorporating approval workflows as part of the standard Sage AP payment process. And then we get those approved and posted. And then within EFT, we're simply replacing the printing of paper-based checks and generating an EFT file. So once we've got that posted batch, we have a file type, which is the type of bank format that's required in order to create the EFT file that complies with the bank and service that I'm using within that bank. And it's important to note here that these formats are used around the world. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, where your vendors are located. This is a global solution for Sage 300, which is a global ERP system. So in Canada, if you've got a relationship with Bank of Nova Scotia, you can see there's a number of different kinds of file types that are required. And this is the most important aspect of making sure that the EFT processing system will work for you, because you need to be able to implement a file type that matches exactly the file format that the bank or financial institution you're working with is using. And again, that's going to be predicated on the bank itself and also the service that you're using. And notice that even here with Bank of Nova Scotia, there's a number of different derivatives on the same type of format. So for instance, here, the PIAP, there's a version 2.1, a version 2.1 check, a version 2.1 wire. And this highlights a couple of things. One is the banks are constantly updating these file formats to add in additional security or validation on these files, but it also highlights the fact that we do more than standard check processing. We can handle any type of payment transaction that your bank supports. So it could be a wire payment, it could be a positive pay payment, and positive pay by definition is where I'm still producing a paper-based check, but I want to send a file to my bank to ensure that they can validate all of the paper-based checks that I have sent. There's also web-based payment formats. We have done bulk Interac email transfer payments. If you're familiar with the Interac email payment processing method, we've done PayPal. We've also done credit card. Now, to be clear, we are not a merchant account, so we're not authorizing the credit card payment. We're simply processing the credit card payment once it's been authorized. But there's the Interac bulk payment for Nova Scotia. And there are other payment processes like EDI formats that can also be supported. So the key is here, when you're looking at implementing EFT within your organization, you're going to need to ask your bank or financial institution for what they call the specification for the file type that you need. And then you can always have BAASS or ourselves review that to ensure that we have a compatible file format for you. And if we don't, we add these free of charge as long as you're running a current version of Sage 300, which is currently version 2019, 2020, and 2021. So once you've got that file format, you're able to create the EFT file. It will be stored on a folder somewhere on your network, and then you'll be able to upload that file to the bank for processing. Now, as I mentioned, you could print a remittance advice. So I'll just print an example so you can see what they look like. These are standard crystal forms within the product, and you can incorporate any type of information that you want. So of course, you'd want the vendor name. You may also want the bank and the financial institution number or the account number, but notice that we're using encryption here. So if we've turned on the encryption, it will encrypt not only on the screen in Sage 300, but also on any document or report we produce. And then it will show you the amount of the payment and the documents that make up that amount. So if there were several invoices, we would see that. However, it doesn't make sense to us if you're going to pay your vendors or employees for that matter electronically to then turn around and print a copy of the remittance advice and have to fold stuff and mail that to your vendor or to your employee. So what we would recommend instead is that you produce an email message that can be sent to your vendors or your employees or your customers for that matter if you're doing direct debits. So as part of the system configuration, we allow you to create these email messages and incorporate different variables such as payment date, payment amount, the document list, the company name or the contact within your organization that's sending the email, and also who the vendor contact is. So this gives you the ability to control the kind of information that you're sending to your vendors or your employees. And the vendor information that you set up for EFT will allow you to incorporate an email address. So you can either use an email address that you've set up within the EFT vendors, or you can use the email address delivery method as part of your AP vendor master file. So as you might be aware, within accounts payable, when you set up your AP vendors, you're able to specify an email address either here on the processing page. So that would be when you do the email, we're looking at an email address on the address page, or contacts email would be the email address on the contact page. So when you specify your delivery method as either email or contact email, the system can be configured to use that email address as well. So it just depends how you wish to incorporate the email address. Now, in some cases, you might want more than one person to receive that email. So simply by entering a semicolon and then putting Robert at Simpatico or some other email address, you can separate them with a semicolon and put as many email addresses in there as will fit in the field length that's available. Now we can see all of your AP vendors within accounts payable. And so when you implement EFT, you'll want to add in their bank account information, which is the purpose for creating this separate table called EFT vendors. But it's reading the AP information from the vendors in accounts payable and then incorporating some additional details that allow you to send payment to your vendors. And again, employees could be the same way electronically. So that's the most important aspect, is getting the file type, being able to generate those payments electronically, and then choosing to email those payments to your vendors so that you're not having to print, fold, and stuff the documents to them. Now, let's go through some additional setup options within EFT to highlight some of the other options that you have. Now, this again happens for AP as well as AR and as well as payroll. And here's the email information that I was referring to, where you would set up a link from the workstation that's creating the EFT payments to the email server. And you'll need to have an outbound port. And this again is going to provide some security and control around when and how you email this information. But don't forget that we also mentioned we can password protect the information that's attached to the email, which would be the remittance advice, by creating a password formula and using a remittance advice password. All right. But this is only selected if you've got email server details entered. So you would start by setting up the email server information. And this will also support secure email connections as well, HTTPS. And then you can attach remittance advices with passwords. This is also where you would determine whether you want to encrypt the bank account details. Now, another important aspect of the system is ensuring the integrity of the vendor information that you're using to send these electronic payments. And again, everything I say applies to employees if you're making direct deposit, or customers if you're doing direct debits. And that is, you can set the default vendor status to entered rather than active, because once the vendor status is active, it means that they can start taking payments. So by saying that the default vendor status is entered when I first set up the vendor, then I force someone else to go in to EFT and switch the status from entered to active. And that can be used as a control to ensure that there's segregation of duties between the person who's setting up the EFT vendors versus the person who's authorizing payment to those vendors. And in addition to that, we keep logs of all the vendor information or customer information or employee information that's set up within the system. So these logs will give you a date and a timestamp, let you know who the vendor name and number is, and the user within Sage 300 who set up that vendor. So in this case, you'll see that information's been set up for the first time as a new value. When we're changing, the system will show you the old value and what the new value is. And if you use that procedure I just described, then you will see when an old value for entered is changed to active and who made that change. So when you want to control how and when vendors are being paid, we think this is a great way to do that by not only logging who set up the information, but forcing someone else who's entered the information to make the vendor active for payment purposes. And this is just using standard security access rights through administrative services. You can specify through the security groups what access rights certain individuals have. So what you do is you allow one person who can view vendor EFT details setup and another one to approve the vendor bank account details. And that gives them the ability to change from entered to active. So you can set up different users with different access rights, and then you might have someone else who's the person responsible for actually generating the EFT AP transactions. These are all discrete access rights to determine who can do what within the EFT module, and creates a more secure environment to make sure that the right person is approving vendors and the right person is generating the EFT transaction files to be sent to those vendors and or uploaded to the bank website. So those are all the things that we incorporate when we're looking at the setup options within EFT. Now, Nancy mentioned before that we can control the creation of an EFT file by saying that we don't allow unposted batches. And of course, if you're going to use the TIROC SOX check approval, that gives you the ability to approve a batch before it can be posted. So by forcing posted batches to be used in EFT, we can ensure that only approved payment batches are being used to generate EFT files. So this is generally considered a best practice, not only because of the approval process, but also just the fact that, as you know, if you make changes to unposted batches, there's no record of those changes within Sage 300 unless you're using some sort of an audit logging tool. So we would recommend that you choose no to allowing unposted batches. You can also select to create EFT files from a range of batches if you'd like. And again, that's up to you. There's no harm either way, but typically the decision will be based on how your bank is charging you for EFT transactions. If they charge you per file upload, then you would say, yes, I want to be able to create an EFT file across a range of payment batches to save on upload charges. But if they're going to charge you based on the number of transactions, then it doesn't matter whether you're sending 2 or 1 EFT files up to the bank website, because they're still going to just track the number of actual payments that you're making. But we do also recommend that when you're talking to your bank, you use this as a bit of a negotiating leverage with them to say that now you're not processing paper-based checks and you'd like to reconsider the kind of banking package that you have with your bank to see if you can get a reduction in some of your fees, or analyze the type of bank account that you want if you're going to be using more electronic type payments rather than paper-based checks. Now, the last option I want to talk about on this page is this ability to skip the vendor or display an error. So what we're referring to here is if we have a payment batch that incorporates both EFT and non-EFT vendors, we want to tell the system to skip over the non-EFT vendors and just produce the EFT payment to the EFT vendors. And that's fine. The system is certainly capable of doing that. But again, we believe best practice would be to separate the payment batch between your EFT vendors and your non-EFT vendors. And the best way to do that, we believe, is through the payment code in the vendor master file. So you would make this an EFT payment code, and then when you create your payment entry, you can do that through create payment batch, and this allows you to specify criteria for what vendors to include. So the criteria in this case would be the payment code EFT, and that would ensure that only those vendors that have been set up for EFT payments are included in that payment batch. And then what some people do is they go one step further and they incorporate a separate bank check stock in bank services, so that there's a unique series of document numbers that are created for my EFT vendors. So that check stock will have a different series of check numbers, and that way you've got a very clean audit trail. You've got a series of document numbers for EFT payments and a series of check numbers for your paper-based or AP laser check and vendor payments. And that again creates a nice clean audit trail for everyone to be able to review and see at a glance. So in that case, then you would display an error and abort the creation of the EFT file if it found a non-EFT vendor within the payment batch. By using the create payment batch function and EFT payment code, that's not likely to happen. So again, this is exactly the same type of setup options for payroll if you want to send payment to your employees. And here you can also encrypt the information, and the remittance advices can be sent, so it's your pay stub information, but we can also send T4s and R1s to your employees as well. So it really does encapsulate everything that you would want to do around payroll processing and sending payments to employees. Likewise, we can do that for direct debits from your customer accounts. So lastly, I wanted to finish off by talking about a few more audit logs and security processes. So in this case, what we do is we're creating a log of every time an EFT file is created. So here you can see it'll identify again a date and a timestamp. It tells you the kind of transaction batch that's included in that EFT file, the user within Sage 300 who's created that EFT file, the bank against which those payments have been made, and where that file has been stored on your network, and the dollar value of the transactions within that batch. And then by double clicking on the line, it will show you the payment details within the AP payment batch. So you can drill into the transaction detail from the audit log and see what was included in the EFT file. And of course, if these are separate payment batches just for EFT purposes, of course, you would expect that all of the payments would be included. But in the case where you're combining check and EFT vendors together, some would be included, some would be excluded. And it's not possible to duplicate pay the same vendor, because just as you would when you produce your checks, you're still printing and posting a document in AP payment batch, which is then setting this flag in the database of Sage 300 to let the system know that vendor invoice has been paid. So that's not possible using EFT to duplicate any payments. The other thing I want to highlight is the transfer details report. This is a report that allows you to show a detailed listing of all the vendors that have been paid within EFT. And this is not so much a system control, but another way that we recommend you test the system for completeness and security is to ensure that you match the transfer details report, which is going to show you when the EFT file was created. It was a payment batch to this bank, and that's the total amount. And then the vendors that were paid and their account details, the fact that it was successfully done. And you would match this to the posting journal for AP, as well as the report that comes back from your bank. And if there's a three-way match, you know that what you set up as a payment batch in AP is what got paid through EFT and what was ultimately processed by your bank. And so, as I say, that's more of an environmental control to ensure that the information that you transmitted to the bank was properly processed. And typically we might have clients test that one or two times when they first start using EFT, and after that they learn to trust the system because this is more secure. And in fact, it's virtually impossible to commit a fraud against an EFT transaction because these files have check digits and hash totals in them, and it's very rare that any type of a file could get through unless it matches exactly with the specification, which is where we started the presentation. You need to have that specification, and what you'll find is that it's probably the most difficult part of implementing EFT is getting the file to get approved by the bank, because they're looking for all this information that has to be part of the file when you're sending the information to them. So this is so important that we emphasize that whenever we're speaking with clients. But once you get that file type correct, everything else generally falls into place. It's a very simple module to set up, and it respects those issues of security and privacy through the encryption, through the controls, the access, and the approvals that we've built into EFT, as well as the audit trails with the audit log reports. So as I say, this is a wonderful solution to support people that now want to do remote payment processing. And if they need approvals, they can build those into the system, and it's all completely documented for anyone to review at year end or to ensure the integrity of the processes that are being made. Now we'll touch on one thing just very briefly here. If you're doing customer direct debits, we've built in an extra feature within EFT where you can create the receipt batches automatically. So for those of you that have subscriptions or memberships where you're doing recurring billing batches in AR, this is a quick way for you to generate the receipt batch against those AR invoice batches by setting the criteria and then creating the receipt batch, because it's that receipt batch we need to create the direct debit file for EFT. So we built this with EFT in mind, but we actually have some clients that use this and they don't use EFT. They're not doing direct debits, but they find the tool so useful to create the receipt batch by specifying the criteria for when and how that batch is created, and then being able to determine what documents get included and whether there's any exclusions by customer or document. So I just wanted to highlight that very quickly as an additional feature within EFT. But I'll finish the presentation there and invite any questions from the audience.
I do have some questions that have already come in. The first one I have is, what is the best way to separate EFT payments from regular check payments for reporting and tracking purposes?
Okay. So I did touch on that in the presentation, but very briefly again, we would recommend using a separate payment code for the vendor. So on EFT vendors, you're separating them by using this EFT payment code, and then you create your payment batch using the payment code as criteria. And then you could go to bank services and actually use a unique series of check numbers based on EFT versus AP laser check stock information. So those are the two best ways to segregate EFT from non-EFT payments.
Can the EFT program generate an EFT to transfer funds to a USD account that is located in the US?
Yes, absolutely. And again, that comes back to the bank file format. Depending on the bank you use, some Canadian banks allow you to send a US dollar payment from a Canadian financial institution, such as TD Bank, but other banks like Royal Bank clear their US payments through JP Morgan in New York. So you have to have a US bank account in order to send US payments. But we support these payments across all borders in any currency that you wish. So it's really just a case of which bank you're using and whether they'll process the US dollar payment in Canada or in the US. But both are possible and we support both.
The transfer report in Crystal Reports, which has a tendency to export in a not so very user-friendly format, can it be exported/produced in a rows column format so it can easily be compared with lookup formulas?
Yep, anything that you create in a Crystal report can be reformatted. So if that's the transfer details report, absolutely. You could easily have someone at BAASS provide a custom format for you because all the information is there. It's just a question of reformatting it within the Crystal report template. And then of course, because it's Crystal, you can export it to Excel or PDF it if you need to.
Is it possible to automate the creation of the EFT file with the upload to the bank website?
That's a great question. Yes, we have had several clients actually say, when I generate the EFT file, because that file gets stored on the network and then someone else goes as a separate step to upload that file to the bank, if it's possible, could I automate that as one step? And the answer is yes, but that would involve using our extender tool where we write this little script that as soon as you've produced the EFT file, we grab that file and we upload it to the bank. But what that also requires is a protocol from the bank that allows us to auto log into the bank website to upload the file. Some of the banks support that through a secure file transfer protocol. Other banks don't do that yet. So it does depend on the bank as to whether we could automate that process for you entirely. But I think most of the banks are getting there. So I would say in 80% of the cases, the answer should be yes.
And the last question I have here is, I saw the EFT for employees on screen. Does that allow you to email pay stubs and T4s? How do you ensure only the employee sees this information?
Okay, yeah. So we did touch on that briefly as well. So yes, we can definitely create EFT file payments to employees, and that can be done based on different banks going to different accounts depending. And you see here, we can add the remittance password. So we can protect that information by putting in a remittance password so only they can open up the attachment for their pay stub or their T4, and that will ensure the security of that data for them. So yeah, that is definitely possible. And then we see the email messages. You would put that in for payroll remittance as well and attach it to this email.
And it does look like that's all the questions that we have for this session. So thank you again, Robert, for presenting.
Thank you very much.